Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Victoria.
So, do you want to start off and give us a bit of an overview of what you've been working on at RBS on open banking and PSD2?
So I've been involved in kind of API initiatives back since about 2015. So I head up requirements for open banking PSD2 for RBS and kind of look after day-to-day interaction with the regulators and with open banking implementation entity. And RBS, the way we've split it out is because open banking from CMA order was very much API driven. And then we look at PSD2 and the requirements for third-party access, we decided to go down the API route for that. So what we have is two separate programs. One that's purely looking at PSD2 excluding third-party access. So that's doing secure customer authentication and looking at, one leg in, one leg out for payments. And there's another program which I'm involved in, which is building APIs both from open banking point of view, but also PSD2.
Fantastic. So can you give a few points on some of the challenges that you've faced implementing a bank-wide API program?
It's not without difficulties. One of the first things really is, do you treat this as purely a mandatory kind of regulatory program, or do you look at what's the opportunity here? So is it a threat, is it an opportunity? We decided early on that building APIs was an opportunity. Even though this is a mandatory program for us, we are seeing it as an opportunity and linking it to other initiatives and innovation. Second challenge is we've been built through acquisition. So we have mainframes, we have architecture that is very legacy, and just trying to replicate account information services or payment initiation on direct channels and going through the spaghetti to work that out. The actual API endpoint is the easy bit. Getting the data out of the core systems is the challenge. And I think the third and final kind of thing I would kind of mention is if you are a kind of multi-brand, multi-kind of customer segment bank, and you have a wide variation of digital channels, but also different account products, payments, etc. When you come to build the APIs and build those services, ensuring kind of air traffic control exercise to ensure that build lands in time for test environments, etc., that is a huge challenge because there are so many API endpoints to build.
And particularly with the rise with new challenger banks, for example, how is RBS competing with that market?
So we've done several things. First of all, we've looked at kind of partnerships and acquisitions. So back about a year ago, we brought Free Agent, which is a kind of business accounting software company, and that's now being integrated into the company. We've also launched into last year Metal, which was a kind of freestanding digital mobile-based business current account, and Bo, which is going to be something similar in kind of retail market coming later this year. But all three of those are standalone operations. They have their own tech stack, their own operations, their own governance, etc. And that's really been the key differentiator. They're not constrained by the kind of heavier and kind of broader governance, stakeholder management, and aged tech stack that the core brand parent bank faces.
And are they able to sort of link in with sort of the core customer journeys that sort of the main brands like NatWest are building, or are they quite distinctive in the rest of the market?
The aim is for them to be more distinctive, to actually be far more kind of customer centric than even we are in kind of mobile banking today, and to be a lot more agile. So they can turn around code, they can address things and release things into market far, far quicker. No, I don't think quite as fast as Monzo was saying yesterday with their kind of doing 60 changes in a day or whatever it was, but it is a lot faster than the core brand. So they are far more responsive and reactive. Yes, they kind of feed off and get some input, but really they are their own masters.
Brilliant. And a recent FinExtra article said that 40% of banks had not met the March deadline. What would your sort of points be for firms who are working hard to meet the June and September deadlines?
That is a big question. Looking at you really need to look at your delivery plan and really where your prioritization is. So if you do have APIs in development, a sandbox in development, and it is kind of behind schedule, then I would prioritize what's the minimum viable kind of product regarding compliance and getting APIs live for June and a sandbox out there. And I would speak to the FCA and kind of be transparent with them. If you really haven't started building a sandbox, let alone building APIs, then you are going to have to probably look at enhanced screen scraping and the fallback mechanism.
And have you seen TPPs using the March sandbox?
It's early days because it's only literally 2 weeks since it went live. We've had a couple of TPPs use a sandbox, but for us, we didn't expect to have a wave because we were one of the CMA 9. We had APIs that went live back in kind of January, February of last year. We have about 20 TPPs using our services, and that grows day by day. So what we tend to find is that some new TPPs would look at the sandbox, but most, when they get authorized or come to market, are going straight to using production.
And how are you keeping customers informed as to what PST2 is all about?
That is a bit sporadic. So back January last year, there was a big customer comms and update to kind of terms and conditions, because basically we were saying that screen scraping was okay for the transition period of PSD2. Then when we launched open banking, we updated and did communications to the website and to in branches, to staff, etc., all about open banking APIs. That's going to have to be refreshed again as we come to this summer. And then for kind of commercial customers, business customers, we've actually ran some forums. I've actually gone and spoken to some forums and kind of got their interested, because they're quite interested in what it means for them going forward in terms of can they use the APIs, what innovation they can do, how can they make their lives easier.
And what benefits do you think there are for customers? So what customer value can actually come out of PSD2?
Quite a few things. I think there's the obvious things that as you go through this process and you expose more and more data and there's greater transparency, that you are going to have more choice and you're going to have, as I said, transparency, more product comparison is a big driver from the CMA order side of things, not PSD2 for that. But PSD2 will give you some of the raw building blocks of APIs to actually go and improve customer journeys and redesign them entirely. And I think we haven't even got there yet. What you're seeing is very early days in terms of the kind of applications that come into market. Payments hasn't really taken off yet. It will do as you get to bring other account information in, so credit cards, flexible savings accounts, etc. That gets a bit more interesting for customers. And really, you've got to think about open finance. I think back to Leon's point, what you mentioned earlier, is exposing mortgages, exposing pensions. That's when it gets really interesting that a customer can see their entire financial position, because at the moment, PSD2 doesn't quite do that for them.
And what do you think some of the potential challenges are going to be for customers, particularly with payment exemptions, for example?
Well, I think even before you get to payment exemptions, the big one is trust. I think after Cambridge Analytica, and we'll talk about Facebook and the way data is used, I think customers are still wary about sharing data with third parties and knowing what the data is being used for. I still think open banking, PSD2 is relatively unknown with customers as well. I think there was a recent YouGov survey when kind of 75% of people didn't know anything about it. And you're right, when you come to payment exemptions, and for payments to work, and for payments to be a compelling kind of competitor to cards, there's a mixed bag, because pretty much every bank's probably interpreted the RTS in a different way and built secure customer authentication in a different way. That needs to be more standardized. The exemptions are being applied differently, and the exemptions aren't all being opened up to third parties, because the way it stands at the moment is that the exemptions are in the kind of mandate of the ASPSP to decide. Mm-hmm. And people haven't developed their thinking as into the risk analysis, fraud profile, and the kind of rationale for opening up the exemptions. I think that will come. But I think on day one, people are being more conservative.
Particularly, I suppose, around transactional risk analysis as well. I think a lot of firms are not going to be applying that for day one, so much more of a day two proposition. So what do you think are the big competitive advantages for some of the big banks to deliver customer value under PSD2?
First of all, being compelled to build APIs. Moving kind of legacy organizations to being API enabled means that you can be far more innovative and far quicker at building new customer experiences, reacting to customer needs. And I think that is a big opportunity. And also at the moment, if you're a large institution with a large customer base, it's there for you to engage those customers and to deepen your relationship with those customers.
Big question. How do you think Brexit's going to affect PSD2 and further API development?
I don't think Brexit is. I think if you go back to 2014, Treasury, with kind of open economy, open data, made it very clear they wanted data to be opened up. Financial services was one of the three sectors they prioritised. The UK was one of the first EU countries to actually write PSD2 international law. If you look at the CMA seizing upon open banking and pushing open data, and there's a recent Furnham report on digital markets and competition, and again open banking was held up as an example there, and they were pushing there, not just talking about data portability but data mobility and giving customers far greater access to their data in more segments, but being able to physically move their data around. So no, I think there are a few challenges, because depending on how the Brexit deal turns out, under GDPR we become a third country. So there might be some challenges there. And the UK doesn't have a QTSP for issuing EIDAS. At the moment, we can go and get a European EIDAS certificate, but within 2 years of Brexit happening, a UK QTSP is going to have to be set up, or some way of dealing with EIDAS.
And like post PSD2, what do you think the future development is actually for open banking and APIs? So after meeting the compliance deadline, what do you think firms should be focusing on?
I truly believe that this is an opportunity, and the way you're going to survive as a bank is by developing everything as an API and by opening up your data, because back to the earlier comment, it's going to happen regardless. And so I think you'll see a shift from open banking to open finance. There's already a kind of mandate for pensions dashboard and for pensions data to be made available. You can see the same in the energy sector. There's a mandate there. It will just go from beyond there. And then I also think that once people have kind of paused, because at the moment there is so much pressure to deliver to quite a tight deadline, that once that has happened, people will start to think about, well, let's look at the commercial opportunities more. And yes, we'll not be compelled to do mortgage data, but we might make mortgage data available and there might be a small charge. Or we might look at the business case for digital identity and digital KYC, because actually that's a potential saving for banks, as it is for third parties and lots of other businesses in the economy. But at the moment, the headspace to kind of really look at those opportunities is a bit limited.
And how's your engagement been with the regulator on sort of your PSD2 programme, and particularly with sort of the RegTech team on what the future is of PSD2?
There hasn't been that much engagement on the future of PSD2. The PSD2 engagement pretty much has been on what has to be in place by March, June, September. And it's a kind of continual dialogue around guidance and kind of latest interpretation. So whereas we've had the RTS since March of last year published, you had the EBA guidance on the exemption process, kind of interim last June, but published back in December. But what you're getting now is the EBA and their API working group and the kind of Q&A tool is kind of updating that. And that is where lots of the conversations are. because it kind of feels like every time there's a bit more guidance, there's a bit more to do.
Brilliant. That's all I had for you, Stephen. So I don't know if you want to take any Q&As from the audience.
Stephen, thanks for sharing with us. You mentioned one of the challenges that RBS faced is the architectural issues in publishing the APIs due to legacy systems and things like that. Do you mind sharing in terms of the cost that RBS had to incur in order to publish these regulatory APIs? And in terms of, do you measure the ROI that you get out of these investments?
I'm not really prepared to share the cost. The cost is more significant than what we initially estimated. I think that's fair to say. In terms of the ROI calculation, that's not something we've worked out yet.
I've got a question on, you mentioned about the regulators and how you found working with regulators, and particularly with some of the exemptions. And in my experience, it feels like sometimes the regulators they don't get the technicalities of open banking sometimes. So when it comes to some of the exemptions, and I'm particularly referring to the Article 10 one, where it's okay, you're exempt from doing SCA if you make a call for balance and transaction every 90 days. But when you apply it to the open banking context, also you've got all those other APIs, like beneficiaries and direct debits. So it's kind of like, when you ask the questions of the regulators, okay, how did it work in that space? Because if you couldn't apply exemptions to those particular APIs, that would make it every third party like y'all, you have to do SCA every time they wanted that data. So I don't know if you've ever had better luck with the regulator when it comes to answering that kind of question, because those kind of little nuances are a bit tricky.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and we have had a similar challenge. But I think what we've tended to do is put the other API endpoints, so whether it's getting direct debit, scheduled payments, etc., really in the same bucket. Because you're not going to get the regulator to give an opinion on every API endpoint versus Article 10. And it's really going to them and saying, this is our interpretation, this is what we're building, tell us otherwise. And from that point, in our interaction with all the regulators, we've had to share our kind of end-to-end customer journeys and what redirection looks like, what authentication looks like, etc.
Beyond the immediate regulatory requirement in this context of what's coming across from the fifth money laundering already and the shared account register requirements that are thinking online. So it seems to be requiring banks to share very similar data that is coming under a completely different regulatory framework. So have you thought about whether maybe that could be utilised for something beyond PSD2?
Very much so. So one of our working principles is to reuse these APIs and reuse these API services as much as possible now we've built them. So when we come to look at new regulation coming in, that's one of the first questions to go and look at, well, what do we have already and does that meet that? And if we tweak it to meet that piece of regulation, does it actually then impact our compliance with PSD2 or the CMA order? And that's when you start to have interesting conversations. No, we haven't yet.
My question is, what are the use cases for operators in open banking space?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
What are the use cases for the corporate customers
Corporate customers, yeah.
in open banking?
That's a really interesting question. So one of the big use cases at the moment is for corporates who take an overnight file of account and transaction history, is to actually have that delivered by API and actually have a richer flow of information via the API than is provided in the overnight file transfer, and to actually be able to add in other accounts such as credit cards and things like that into their accounting and ERP platforms. I also think that corporates are quite interested to understand how they can use the payment APIs and whether they can either partner with the bank as a PISP or partner with PISPs to see how they can actually improve their kind of invoicing, settlement and reconciliation, and being able to tie that in to getting money quicker and more efficiently flowing through their operations. And that kind of links into some of in the UK, the payment systems regulator is kind of also pushing for confirmation of payee, but also request to pay and enhanced data. And corporates are very interested in request to pay as an alternative to direct debit. And that's going to be driven off PSD2 APIs.
Any more questions? We'll take one last question before we move on to the next session.
Stephen Mahesh here. Thanks for the insights into what RBS is doing. While we're all busy opening up the gate, so to speak, right, through the APIs, now obviously we know data in motion is not really reality, right? And once they're going to be opened up, it's going to be a two-way street. What about the data deluge that's going to follow after this? Because it's probably going to be, once it's opened up, you can't really control it, right? Like what Leon was presenting earlier, this huge harness that need to run on top of the data. Can you give some early thoughts on how you're treating this?
I'm just trying to see if I understand the question correctly. Talking about us actually consuming data in both ways. So data going out, well, we've dimensioned the API services to be as available and as performant as our direct channels. And that's what we're kind of basing our forecasting and actually building that capacity in. The interesting thing is more on the other side about how we consume the data and how you manage that under GDPR as well, and how you treat that and update that data and keep that separate from the other data that you've got. So we've looked at having a kind of group-wide solution to that, but we've actually gone and used a third party at the moment to provide that, to get it off the ground.
All right.
Sorry, you mentioned things. One last question, so
Yes, this is a feedback. Just a thought that occurred. Has RBS thought about using what open banking has been doing to make use of that data internally? What I mean by this is that on many occasions, even in big incumbent banks, the left hand is not to the right hand. So I'm just thinking, have you given it any thought? Is there thought processes of, we're looking at going out to customers and how this can benefit the customers and how the fintechs are useful. But is there something that you're thinking of internally? Maybe you don't want to share it. But you see where this functions.
It's from day one, we have been very clear that we want to kind of eat our own dog food and reuse our own APIs. So every API service that we've built is also available to internal developers to use. And that's what's going to start powering kind of the next wave of kind of digital proposition development and innovation is through that. But that's definitely been a clear kind of principle from day one, is we want to reuse the APIs as much as provide them to third parties.